Okay, I'm going to start and more people can join before we, I'll do some housekeeping and then more people can join before we start our session for today. So hi everyone, thank you for joining this webinar. The topic is crop pollination services modelling, an interesting topic for this, the CIWEM Central Southern branch that's hosting the session. I'm Alex Lane, Vice Chair of the branch. I'm just going to go through some general housekeeping and then I'll pass over to our presenter Mike to go through the session. So I think most people know what CIWEM is and what it stands for, but CIWEM is a Royal Chartered Professional Body and independent charity. Its aim is to work towards a safer, more sustainable world, building a global community of water and environmental professionals dedicated to working for the public benefit. We're hosted, CIWEM's connected to a range of national and international sort of initiatives and events through digital series and hosts a variety of sort of webinars and other types of events, which I'll touch on after the session today. Barbara will post some links to relevant events in the chat as we go through. General bit of housekeeping for this session. The event's being recorded and will be published on the CIWEM YouTube channel in due course after the event. If you experience any technical issues during the session and you need any assistance, please post those in the chat box, not the Q&A box. The Q&A box is for technical questions about what you're hearing, and we'll come to those at the end of the session, and Michael has some time to respond to those. This session is contributes towards continuing professional development, your CPD, so it's an hour available for this, but CIWEM doesn't provide actual certificates. It's up to you to record the information. So just a quick introduction to our presenter, Mike Image. So Mike is a senior consultant at Atkins Natural Capital team. He's got 20 years experience in the environmental management and financial services sectors. His areas of expertise are natural capital assessment, agri-environment policy evaluation, and design of environmental land management schemes. He's delivered several projects for national governments, government agencies, and water companies in the UK and Ireland. His doctoral research conducted at the University of Reading, which forms the basis of this presentation, used spatial modelling, regression, and scenario analysis to examine how agri-environment schemes and tree planting have affected crop pollination services at national scale in England. Sounds like a really interesting talk, something a bit different for the branch, so looking forward to it. We'll have Q&A at the end, but over to Mike for now.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thanks to all at CIWEM for allowing to give this talk, and thanks to all those who've joined. I should mention this point that my work was part funded by a grant from the University of Reading, and I've also benefited from funding and data that's provided by the Resilient Pollination Project led by the University of Reading and funded by BBR, SRC, NERC, ESRC and the Scottish Government under the Global Food Security Programme. So my talk today is going to have 5 sections and hopefully will take about 35 minutes, so we'll still have a bit of time for Q&A at the end. Firstly, I'll cover what wild bees are, why they're important for crop pollination and how we model this. Then I'll talk a bit about agri-environment schemes and why they're important for wild bees. Then I'll talk about the 3 studies that have made up my PhD thesis. The first looks at whether the aggregate sum of participation in agri-environment schemes as a whole has benefited crop pollination services in England. That one's published, and you can find a link to the paper below. The second looks into what interventions are driving the effects we predict in the first paper. And the final paper takes a forward-looking approach, examining if and how ambitions for tree planting might benefit crop pollination. Those last 2 papers are currently in peer review, so wherever I've included figures from them, I've put a no photo marker on the slide. That's not to say you shouldn't take a photo of it, but if you do share it outside of this world, I would appreciate if you can qualify that the findings are very much still provisional. So, firstly, a bit of background. In England, the four main crops that we grow that are dependent on insect pollination to some degree are oilseed rape, field beans, and broad beans, you might know them by that term, orchard fruit, so apples and pears, etc., and soft fruit, by which I mean strawberries and raspberries, etc. Oilseed rape and field beans are break crops in a typical arable rotation cycle, and so are quite widespread. Orchards and soft fruit are much more restricted in their distribution, being mainly grown in sort of higher grade ag soils in the southeast and in Western England. Oilseed rape and field bean yields about 25% dependent on insect pollination, whereas the sort of orchards and the soft fruit crops are completely dependent on pollination, insect pollination. Sorry. Now we do have some managed pollinators, but they can only supply some of the requirement. Honeybees at most provide perhaps a third of the crop pollination service demand that we need in this country, and probably in reality it's a lot, they supply a lot less than that. Soft fruit grown in glasshouse and polytunnel systems, they'll particularly provide their own bumblebee nests within the system to ensure that pollination occurs, but that only applies to those enclosed systems. It doesn't apply to soft fruit that's grown outside of polytunnels or glass houses. Now, honeybees, despite what you might have heard, are not actually a threat of extinction. They do have some challenges from the way they're managed, in particular the Varroa destructor mite, but they're not threatened, from habitat loss, at least in the same way that that wild bees are, which I'll come on to in a minute. The bulk of pollination in this country is actually carried out by wild pollinators, which in England principally means bumblebees, solitary bees, and hoverflies. Now, these are definitely threatened, and we've seen some significant population declines over the last century. Lots of reasons for that, pesticides being one of them, disease and competition, in particular from managed pollinators, is another, and more recently climate change is starting to be a factor. But probably the biggest factor that's been driving a lot of these population declines has been land use change, especially in the agricultural context, as features that used to provide habitat, hedgerows, meadows, and so on, have been replaced with more intensive agricultural systems. And wild bees need places to nest and flowers on which to forage for nectar, which is where they get carbohydrate, and pollen, protein, for themselves and for their broods. The preferences vary between species depending on sort of morphology and so on. If we take bumblebees first, well, there are 24 species of these in the UK, which we can roughly split into two sort of guilds. By a guild, I mean a species grouping with common characteristics. So ground nesting bumblebees, as the name suggests, such as the buff-tailed bumblebee, which is one of the most common bees, Bombus stresses, that they nest underground or on the ground in dense vegetation. The tree nesting bumblebees is actually really only one species, Bombus hypnorum, and they nest aerially in tree cavities or actually even in man-made structures like abandoned bird boxes or even the user houses. Now, bumblebees are eusocial, which means they live in colonies where there's division of labor between sort of castes and genders. And in a typical life cycle, a queen will emerge from hibernation in early spring. She'll search for a nesting site in a range of sort of about 1 kilometre on average, roughly, from where she overwintered. She'll start off foraging for herself, within a foraging kernel, maybe sort of 0.5 kilometre on average wide, can be wider depending on the species. When she finds a suitable site, she'll start laying eggs there. As long as she can generate forage for enough resources, these will hatch into workers, and then by late spring, these workers will have taken over the foraging, and the queen will just stay in the nest and keep laying eggs. And as long as there's enough resources being collected for the colony will grow. And for bumblebees, they'll typically, again, depends on the species, but typically they might have 100 to 200 workers in a nest by the summer. At that point, she'll start laying reproductive individuals, so the males and the new queens. They'll emerge, they'll mate. The males, the workers, and the old queen will die off. The new queen will then go and hibernate into the next year, and so on. I should also qualify at this point that 6 of the 24 bumblebee species we have in the UK are cuckoos, so they parasitize other bumblebee species' nests, effectively taking over from the queens. We won't consider those in this study. Then there are the solitary bees, and as the name suggests, these are bees that don't produce workers, but instead emerge their life cycle. They emerge from their nests, they find a new nesting site, forage for themselves. That dispersal and foraging range is typically much shorter than it is to bumblebees, maybe a few hundred meters on average. They'll mate, female will lay eggs, and then the parents will die off. The eggs will then hatch into the next year, and so the cycle continues. Now, some of these species will emerge in spring, maybe some others later in the year. And actually, there are over 200 species of solitary bee in the UK, and we can crudely separate them into 2 guilds. So ground nesters, which nest in underground sort of tunnel systems, and cowrie nesters, which nest aerially in holes in trees, holes in other vegetation, walls, buildings, and artificial features. Your classic bee hotels, that sort of thing, in which they might nest. I'm not going to cover hive flies in this talk, and that's because we have yet to model them in our modeling environment. So this talk is really focused only on bees. Now, bees need floral resources throughout the seasons in which they're active. As we can see in rural environments, this phenology of the availability of crops throughout the availability of floral resources throughout the year is quite variable. Because trees flower typically earlier than grasses and crops, so your orchards, your hedgerows, and your woodland edges, the first things that flower at the start of spring. Then your mass flowering crops, your OSR and your field beans, they'll kick in later spring, the start of summer. And then your sort of non-tree semi-natural habitats, your grasslands, your meadows, your field margins, and your soft fruit will then flower into the summer. You also get flowering from sort of orchards, hedgerows, etc. in the summer. That's obviously not from the trees, but that's from the sort of understory vegetation within those habitats. And then when you get to autumn, well, there's usually very little foraging resource left available, other than perhaps some late flowering plants such as ivy. Now, most sort of researchers tend to study bee visitation to crops in situ, so they'll literally count visits to flowers or trap the bees to get accurate population estimates, which is fine if you're working at local scale. But if you want to understand effects over landscape scale, that becomes a bit problematic. Approaches that use sort of habitat-based proxies, where they sort of say, well, this is the area of some bee sporting habitat within the thing, and then scale them up from there, they're not always reliable because bees have constrained foraging and dispersal ranges. So if we look at the 2 configurations on the slide below, the second configuration, well, they both have the same area of habitat, the same quality of habitat, but the second configuration provides much better access to resources throughout the life cycle, and the oilseed rape field is close enough to the hedgerow to be able to benefit from the additional bees that might have nested there as a result of the hedgerow being there. So to understand how landscapes affect crop pollination services, you really need to consider the spatial distribution of resources, and also, as you saw from the previous slide, the temporal distribution of that resource throughout the bee's life cycle. The model that we've used to do this is called Pol for Pop, and it's a process-based model that simulates how bees nest and forage in a landscape over their life cycle. It's been developed over a number of years, and the latest iteration was parameterized for Great Britain for 4 wild bee guilds and for 45 land cover types by Emma Gardner, who's one of my supervisors and co-authors. It takes a land cover map as its input, and then a set of parameters for each land cover type to indicate how much floral cover they provide by season and how attractive they are for the bee guild of interest. from a nesting and from a floral perspective. And it also takes a set of parameters that constrain the number of nests per unit area, and also the typical foraging and dispersal kernels for that bee guild, and also how many new workers, if it's a bumblebee, or reproductive individuals the colony will produce. It converts the land cover map into maps of nesting and floral resource quality by season, then cycles through the year, returning for each season the number of nests, the number of bees, so the workers and reproductive individuals, and the visitation rate to the floral resources in the landscape, which obviously includes the crops. And it also works out, how much resource the bees will gather, which then informs how many bees there'll be in the next season. Then at the end of the year, it will model the process where the reproductive individuals will then disperse, find new nesting sites, and so the cycle continues. And as I say, this has been validated against observed bee abundances across Great Britain. So now on to ag-environment schemes. One of the key ways in which we can enhance the availability of floral nesting resources for our bees in ag landscapes is through ag-environment schemes. And I'm assuming most people on the call are probably aware of what they are, but in case there are some who are not, just say they're voluntary schemes where farmers are paid, typically by governments, to create or maintain land in ways that enhances the environment. The active scheme right now in England is countryside stewardship, but that will be replaced fairly shortly by the Environmental Land Management Scheme, or ELMS, as we transition towards the post-Brexit, post-Common Agricultural Policy world. In 2016, there were about 1.5 million hectares of land in England under agri-environment scheme management. Now, much of that was actually in the uplands or remote parts of the country, but there were still some options taken up in more productive, more intensive agricultural areas. Now, some agri-environment scheme interventions, management options, are intentionally aimed at wild bees, so your sort of field margins and hedgerow management, for example, very much intended to provide floral resources for bees. But actually, most will provide some kind of floral nesting enhancement by virtue of what they do relative to what would have been there otherwise. But the extent of this can vary quite a bit in terms of the quality of the floral resource, the nesting resource, the quantity of it, how much cover of resources is there, and how attractive they are to different guilds or species of bee. We do know from field work, at least at local scale, they do have a positive effect on wild bee abundance and diversity. We also know from field work that, again, at least at local scale, that they can, but not always, have an indirect effect on crop pollination, where as a result of increasing the populations, there are more bees available to forage on nearby crops, such as oilseed rape and field beans. But that's only known at the local scale. What about the larger scale, i.e. the scale which the scheme is applied, so in effect the entire country? What has that scheme overall done for crop pollination services to the widespread crops like oilseed rape and field beans that mainly flower in late spring? Has it done anything for orchard fruit, which flowers much earlier in the year, or for soft fruit, by which I mean the stuff that's not in polytunnels, thus depends on wild pollinators, that flowers in the summer? And that takes me neatly onto my thesis and the 3 studies that I undertook with the poll for pot model. So the first of these is very much the big picture. What did the scheme as a whole do for bee abundance and crop pollination services? So to do this, I built a high resolution map of land cover where every crop parcel in England, every agri-environment scheme feature, and all the other habitat that we have in the country was accurately digitized for a given reference year, which in this case is 2016. Then parameterize it for a scenario where the agri-environment scheme features were present, and then for an alternative scenario representing where they were absent and the management had reverted to what it would have been if the scheme were not there. Now, these parameters are based on EMA's parameters, but also reflected parameters we developed for counterfactual scenarios for the where the scheme was absent. And that's based on scenarios that were done for Natural England as part of sort of carbon modelling work. So then I used those to compare the abundance and the visitation rate of the 4 crops in both scenarios, looking at the difference, well, the change in the two, taking into account the uncertainty in the input parameters. And this was done for each of the 4 wildlife guilds we mentioned above, and obviously looking at visitation to all 4 of those crops. What do we predict? What do we predict? Sorry. Well, for the abundance, first of all, we find that the scheme has increased the number of nests, but fairly slightly for ground nesting bumblebees, a little bit more for ground nesting solitary bees. But this effect is only statistically significant for those ground nesting guilds. We didn't see any significant increases for the tree nesting or the cavity nesting solitary bees. It also increased the number of workers produced during the season and number of sort of new queens and solitary bean females that are produced at the end of the season. Again, we only saw that for the ground nesting guilds. And just to point out that the increase in the production of workers and the production of new queens is higher than the increase in the production of new nests. So in other words, what we're seeing as schemes are generally supporting this intra-year population growth rather than inter-year. So in other words, there's a nesting limitation in the scheme. From a visitation perspective, well, there's an increase in the visitation, again, of the ground nesting guilds to our mass vine crops or RSR and field beans in the season, in which in late spring when they're most dependent on crop pollinate, when they're mostly flowering. But it wasn't significant. And I would say that we did see a significant increase for ground nesting solitary bees to field beans, but that was from a very, very low base, so not really material. So in other words, we don't see overall a really significant increase, or that we do see some increase. And we don't see any sign of any increase in visitation to orchards or strawberries. Now, that doesn't mean that we aren't seeing some increase. So if we look at the map of how OSR and field bean increases look, we can see that there is about sort of 39% of the national oilseed rape crop cover that's experiencing a significant pollination service increase, and about 34% of the field bean cropping area. But obviously that means 61% is not, or 66% in the case of field beans for bumblebees, and we're not seeing any effect for solitary bees. And we don't see anything anywhere for orchards, early spring, or soft fruit in the summer for bumblebees or solitary bees. So if we zoom into the map, we can get a bit of a better sense of what's going on and what possibly some of the reasons for these changes, these observations are. So this is a map of ground nesting bumblebee visitation in late spring. Sorry, the change in bumblebee visitation late spring in the sort of middle here for a zoomed in area. And on the right, this is the same for solitary bees. And what you can see for the solitary bees is that the increases are very much confined to the sites where the interventions have been located, whereas the bumblebees are clearly foraging beyond the agri-environment scheme intervention sites and into neighbouring areas. And where those spillover areas happen to hit OSR or field bean parcels, then they trigger significant increases. But those increases don't cover the whole area. So there's plenty of OSR and field beans within this area that aren't experiencing those increases. For orchards and soft fruit, if we look at where those parcels are in this sort of zoomed in area. It's hopefully clear from this that they don't really coincide with where the greatest density of agri-environment scheme feature has been located. So it could just be that the failure to trigger orchard or soft fruit pollination service enhancement could just be because there wasn't enough agri-environment scheme uptake near to those crops. Another possible reason is that, so for orchards at least, so orchards flower in the early part of spring. So they are dependent on, or mostly dependent on bumblebee queens and solitary bees for pollination. The workers in general haven't yet emerged to do the pollination by the time those the trees are flowering. So to get an enhancement in orchard pollination, you need that inter-year increase and not just an intra-year increase. So in other words, you need more nests. But because nesting enhancement is only a few percentage points, sort of 4% or so, maybe that just isn't enough to make a difference to orchard fruit pollination. So to summarize for that first paper, schemes tend to make nests more productive. We get more workers, we get more queens, rather than making nests more abundant. And that's probably because they're more aligned towards interventions that provide floral resources later in the spring and in the summer. They also tend to benefit ground nesting species more than aerial nesting species. And again, that's probably because of the type of interventions that they're supporting. We see some evidence of localized bumblebee visitation increase to RSR and field beans in the late spring, but no other material increases for anything else. What does this mean for elms? Well, we recommend very much that schemes need to think more about providing nest sites and getting those targeted closer to crops, especially your orchards and your soft fruit. And more resource provision for specialist pollinators would also be a good thing. My second paper sort of digs a bit more deeply into the finding from the first paper that agri-environment scheme features provide this sort of spatially heterogeneous increase in ground nesting bumblebee visitation rate to RSR and field beans, and sort of ask, well, which of the 200 or so interventions that made up countryside stewardship scheme, which are driving this this net effect, and how does it which are responsible for this? 200 interventions is a bit much for one study to handle, and actually many of them are quite similar in terms of what they do. So the first thing we did in this study was to categorize our interventions into 10 groups which had sort of similar management qualities and resource provision in terms of floral nesting value. So this breaks things down into hedgerow woodland edge management, grassy field margins, floral margins. So floral margins are with our margins, grass field margins with sown flowers in them, fallow plots, flower-rich lays, and then we move more into the habitat, the bigger habitat features. So your grassland and your sort of lowland heath creation measures, woodland scrub, wood pasture creation measures. Traditional orchard creation, we sort of separated that out because the trees involved flower earlier in the year and have a very different resource quality to these. So we separated those out to be different. And then wetland and sort of coastal habitats, which generally aren't so valuable. They are valuable to certain types of bees, but not in general, not less so. And habitat management, which is a bit of a catch-all category for management options that don't sort of change the resource quality of habitats that much. They just simply generally just maintain them. A lot of those relate to sort of management of uplands and so on. Now, as you can see, these sort of all these interventions, they vary in the quality of floral nesting resource provision and also in the quantity of their uptake. And by the quality, we mean the sort of combination of nesting resource they provide. And in this case, we're looking particularly at early spring floral resource. And the reason why we're looking at early spring floral resource as opposed to floral resource later in the year is that we know from other work that's been done is that this is more likely to be important for bees than the summer resource, not just in terms of boosting population growth, but particularly providing pollination service to things like oilseed rape and field beans that flower in late spring. So in other words, if you want lots of worker bees to forage on OSR and field beans, you need to make sure that the queen has had plenty of forage available in early spring, so she can produce lots more workers in late spring when the crops actually need them. It's less important about providing the summer resources because those crops have already flowered. Now, the quantity of uptake, as you can also hopefully see here, has a geographic spread. So it means that some interventions just aren't going to be located very near to crops in general. And something that you can't quite see at this level of extraction is that interventions will vary in terms of where they're located within an area with respect to the crops, and also respect to other interventions, and also to floral nesting resource outside of the scheme as well. Now, ideally, we'd like to know which interventions are contributing the most towards this net effect, and we'd also like to know whether it's down to the quality, or whether it's just about the sheer amount of them, or whether it's to do with how they've been placed within the tile, with respect to the crops at a bigger scale or shorter scale. So to do this, we aggregated the visitation rate changes we found from the first paper to OSR and field beans in late spring to a 10-kilometre grid scale, and then regress these outputs against the area of each intervention in those 10-kilometre grids, allowing for interactions and also the contextual effect of non-scheme resource. In general, what we see is the net effect is primarily driven by quality, with hedgerow and woodland edge management leading the way in terms of that. Floral margins are effective, but they're as effective as we would predict from their combined floral nesting score. They're not deemed to be a higher quality resource because they provide most of their resources actually in the summer after the OSR and field beans are already flowered. So the bees the workers who are foraging on the field beans don't benefit from the extra enhancement to population that they would get otherwise, which they do get from the hedgerows and the woodland edge. Quantity essentially just tells us really whether an effect is significant or not. So some features like sort of scrub and woodland creation, flower-rich lays, traditional orchards, just don't have enough of them in the scheme to trigger effects, even though they could be, certainly in the case of traditional orchards, potentially quite a valuable resource because they provide a lot of floral resources in the early spring. We are able to infer some placement effects. And one of the interesting things we found was that fallow, and to a certain extent grass margins, which are not particularly high value habitats, they're okay, but they're not amazing. We see a really strong contribution, particularly to the field bean net effect. And we think this is because field beans are a little bit rarer in the landscape than oilseed rape. So the extent to which they respond to the interventions, they're much more sensitive to the placement of those features. And particularly in the sort of more intensive arable landscapes where they're grown in rotation, there's generally less availability of other interventions in that or pre-existing semi-natural habitat in those areas. So those sort of average quality interventions like fallow and grass margins actually become quite valuable in terms of boosting pollination services in those areas. So to summarize for this study, schemes provide a geographically inconsistent supply of high quality interventions, early spring floral nesting, such as hedgerows, that support interventions that provide sort of high value summer resources, generally where existing resources are probably already abundant. Where resources aren't abundant and are in demand, like so in the most intense arable areas, there are some well-targeted moderate quality resources like fallow and grass margins, which does help. But what should the next generation of schemes do? Well, provide more widespread early flowering options, hedgerows, woodland edge management, but also maybe some agroforestry models would also work. Change the flower mix of those floral margins so that they provide more early spring resources will also be good. But continue to support the fallow and the grass margins, which just by definition are always going to be near the crops. Then the final paper looks more forward. So we don't yet know what the full details are going to be for elms. And to be honest, we don't even know some of the basic detail right now for the bottom tier, the sustainable farming incentive. One thing we know that is coming is a big demand for more trees in agricultural landscapes. England doesn't have much woodland, relatively speaking, 10% land cover, which is one of the lowest in Europe. And we're currently planting around sort of 2,000 hectares of woodland a year. That's an improvement on the sort of 1,000 hectares a year we used to plant a decade or so ago. But in the England Trees Action Plan, the government released I think last year, they announced ambitions to get to 7,000 hectares per year planting by 2024. And this actually needs to continue at this level through 2035 and then beyond, if we're to meet the Committee on Climate Change's targets set out in the UK's 6th carbon budget. Now, most of this will need to be met through woodland creation, where the carbon sequestration rates are the highest. But carbon isn't the only game in town, and there are other ways of introducing trees to farm landscapes, which might actually do more for biodiversity and address farmers' concerns about tree planting. So this includes things like planting more hedgerows, but also silver arable agroforestry. And the Committee on Climate Change has set actually some targets, both of these, in terms of how much they'd like to see in the landscape by 2035 or 2050. And as we've seen above, hedgerows and some types of trees using agroforestry systems, so say fruit trees and willow, they provide early flowering resources, which are actually quite valuable for wild bees and for crop pollination services. So with this in mind, for this study, we asked ourselves the question, will these planting measures, benefit crop pollination services relative to what they have? And how do they compare against each other? So to do this, we picked a representative 10 kilometre squared tile plus a buffer zone that we felt was most representative of OSR and field bean growing conditions in England. Then simulated uptake of 6 intervention types, so standard woodland creation, hedgerow planting in 2 different ways, so clustered or distributed around the landscape, then agroforestry, silver arable, alley cropping, but using 3 different tree types to see what the difference would be. We set the same area budget of tree cover across the across interventions, but we tried different planting intensities. So one that's equivalent to the sort of 2 and a bit thousand hectares we're planting right now, and one that's equivalent to the 7,000 rate, so basically 3 times as much. Compare those to the current baseline, and then against each other, the same level of planting intensity. And we just do this with bumblebees, but we also include the tree nesting bumblebee, just because of the obvious fact that we're talking about tree planting, and this is like very, very likely to benefit that bee. The scenarios, this just show how they're created and what they look in the landscape. These maps, they just show one example. And in practice, we actually took 100 simulations for each intervention, each with a different spatial placement and input parameter. So the uncertainty over where interventions are placed and parameters are captured. So then we could run an over and post-hoc tests to see if their means are significantly different. What do we find? Well, from an abundance perspective, hedgerows, woodland and fruit trees, they all promote increases in population relative to the baseline. But these are greatest for the hedgerows, for ground nesting bumblebees, and for the woodland, for tree nesting bumblebees. And this just reflects the relative nesting and flora resource attractiveness of those tree types to different gills. Ground nesting bumblebees like hedgerows, tree nesting bumblebees like woodland for nesting. Agroforestry, specifically the willow and fruit tree approaches, they provide great early spring flora resources. They really boost the intra-year populations, but they don't quite provide the same quality of nesting resource as you do for the other interventions, although fruit trees do offer some. In terms of visitation, most interventions have an effect on visitation, but in some cases, sort of woodland and agroforestry are popular, you need a much higher intensity to get any effect, whereas you get a really strong boost for fruit tree and willow agroforestry, even at low planting intensity. The impact in particular on field bean crop pollination service is particularly strong, but it's also quite variable. From a hedgerow perspective, it's a more consistent signal, but it didn't seem to matter very much whether we spread the hedgerows out or the landscape were clustered in certain areas. As long as we provided enough, we'd get an effect. Now, this is all partly to do with relative resource quality. So fruit trees and willow provide that really good early spring flora resource, which certainly poplar doesn't, and other habitats do to a more limited extent. But it's also a lot to do with placement. Agroforestry, by definition, is always going to be next to some kind of crop, and obviously they're reasonably distributed across the landscape. So most of the crops get some benefit, as maybe see here, some crops get a really intense benefit. Hedgerows are sometimes going to be next to the crops, but sometimes not. But because of them more distributed, they provide a more consistent increase across the landscape, albeit at a lower average rate than agroforestry. And woodland is just so concentrated in a few bits of the area that it's generally just a bit too far from the crops to make a difference. So to summarize from this study, so woodland is going to increase bumblebee populations, but the effect is a bit too geographically concentrated to benefit crop pollination services. Hedgerows will also increase populations and particularly for ground nesting bumblebees, and do a bit of a better job for a crop pollination service because they're more distributed throughout the landscape. Agroforestry, at least for fruit tree and willow, is going to give you the best pollination service return for the area of intervention invested, but this could end up being quite variable if crops are rotating through the landscape. So yeah, although we know that carbon is important, from biodiversity and crop pollination perspective, we really would like to see agroforestry and hedge planting to be an integral feature within the ELM scheme. And it's encouraging to see there will probably be an agroforestry standard in the sustainable farming incentive, the lower tier of ELMs. But it's really important that the tree species that are chosen provide early season flora resource in order to get the best crop pollination service return. And you might want to think about combining hedgerow planting and agroforestry to get the most stable crop pollination service enhancement, whilst also stabilizing populations as well, and also also considering the fact that the crops are going to rotate. So we now come to the end of the talk. Hopefully it's been informative and useful, and thanks so much for listening. In fact, I'll leave you a quick summary to refresh your memory, and these are maybe my pointers. Hopefully the peer review process will speed up and I can get those final two papers published. And when I do, I'll circulate the links to Barbara so that she can share with you, or else you can find me on LinkedIn where I will post a link when they're available. And I'm happy to take questions now. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mike. Really interesting talk, especially considering so much is sort of changing around the policy landscape at the moment. Lots to think about, definitely. Yeah, if people have questions, please post them in the Q&A box. There's a few have come in, but we've got about sort of maybe just about 10 minutes, a few minutes less for Q&A, so we'll be able to cover a good few. So please do pop them in the Q&A box. One to start here, which was raised about the fact that quite a lot in your work seems to rely on the sort of timing of intervention, that sort of spring period being quite important.
Yeah.
The question is about sort of climate change impacts on the species, on like the bees themselves, and maybe the timings of their life cycles are changing. The timings of the life cycles of the plants and stuff are changing as well. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about what impact that could have, or the challenges that presents to trying to do this sort of research, I guess.
Well, I mean, it is quite challenging, and one of the things that we want to do going forward is include a climate aspect to the model, so that we can then simulate what those impacts will be over a sort of 20 or 30 year period, to get a sense of whether whether the phenology changes, and whether that has an impact on pollination. I mean, it might be good, it might be problematic if things kind of come out of sync. I mean, it's very much about trying to make sure that we provide a consistent level of floral resource throughout the year for wild bees. So if the season ends up becoming longer as a result of climate change, then that means we need to think about, especially providing interventions very sooner in the season, but also at the end of the season as well. And that's one of the things that we're looking at.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question myself, actually. Like, I think one of the things you touched on is that trade-offs really interesting here, isn't it? You've got the carbon benefits. There's also other things like elms might be trying to promote, or the sector's interested in general, things like flood risk management, for example. Do you think, are there other areas where there's those trade-offs need to be considered? Have you thought about that in your work or follow-on stuff?
Well, I mean, certainly in terms of the flood risk management, I think we would like to see a bit more research on the possible sort of water quality and well, it's not talking flood risk, but water in general, so water quality and water resources aspects of agroforestry. Say, for example, particularly in terms of does it make can we find a win-win situations that will generate other benefits for the tree species that are going to be most beneficial for wild bees in those kind of models. Is there would there be benefits in terms of hedgerow planting, in terms of where to plant those strategically to optimize both water aspects and for crop pollination aspects? I think to really understand those, you need to sort of look at optimization tools, and there is some work being planned in that area to sort of think about how things are going to how we can optimize across different ecosystem services for this. I mean, another area that where there's often a lot of crossover with this is pest control, for example. I mean, some of these interventions are going to potentially help provide pest control species, although that's an area that needs more research. Okay,
thank you. Technical question here, so I'll try and convey it correctly. I think your research there showed that the AES didn't significantly increase crop pollination. So does that mean that there was no benefit from increased pollinator populations on agricultural production? And would there be other associated benefits that might justify other reasons to justify why that would be important?
Well, we didn't see to qualify that thing. We do see some increases for oilseed rape and field beans, but it's not the whole country. It's like 40% or 35% ish of the resource. So we are seeing some benefits, but it's just not. It's not to everyone. So some farms are going to benefit, and some farms are not. We're not really seeing the reason why we're not seeing the change for the orchard fruit and the soft fruit is probably because, I mean, I'll speculate a number of things, but I think mostly it's because they were just not putting enough interventions in those locations. And the other aspect of that question is that the model at the moment doesn't it predicts a change in visitation. It will tell you the change in visitation. It won't tell you the change in yield. So that has only just been worked out for the model in terms of the and it will be in the next evolution of this project, we'll be running the analyses again, but looking at the impact on yield. And that's more complicated because yield doesn't just go up with visitation. Eventually there's a threshold at which you can't increase the amount of yield to the crop by having more bees pollinate it. So that means what then becomes important is knowing where in the country there are deficits in yield because there aren't enough interventions, and that will probably be informing more in terms of where to locate these interventions. But it's they're still providing these interventions are still providing value, and they're still providing obviously a lot of things outside of crop pollination services, and they're supporting populations of bees in general, and they're supporting biodiversity. So they're still doing lots of good things. We think they could potentially do more if they were a little bit better targeted, and if we change the specifications and so on to improve certain aspects of them.
Okay, great, thank you. I guess we touched on it a little bit. Maybe you could just explore some of the other sort of limitations of the modelling. Are there other things you haven't been able to talk about here that are also important? One thing that was mentioned in questions was about whether your model accounts for the fact that, might it be the case that to provide those extra habitats, you have to actually lose some of the crop area? So there's that obviously reduces the total yield. Is that accounted for, or could that be a concern?
Yeah, I mean, it's it isn't. I mean, in this model, it isn't accounted for because we just look at visitation. It will have to be accounted for when we look at yield. But the flip side of that is that obviously with the agri-environment interventions, you're paid on an income forgone, cost plus income forgone basis. So anything you've lost, well, in theory, from taking that land out, you'll get back as a payment. So I mean, there will be a reduction in the cropping area, but this is something that's inevitably going to happen anyway as a result of needing to put interventions, whether it's a crop pollination benefit or for more wider biodiversity benefit. So it's something that definitely we have to consider. And I think everyone knows that probably you're going to take out maybe more land than you're going to get back in terms of crop pollination service, but you've got to take that land out anyway. So you might as well work out, well, how can I get the most out of the land that I'm taking out? And if it means increasing the crop pollination service to the rest of the crops that you've got, then that's better than just putting it randomly.
Yep. Okay, thank you. Maybe just one final question. It's more of a asking you to reflect really, but you've made some sort of recommendations for sort of elms there. Do you feel like how likely are these things to be included? Is that just complete speculation? Do you have any insight about where the direction of things?
Well, we've got a bit of insight on. Okay, I mean, we know that there's going to be an agroforestry standard, for example. What we don't know yet is what kind of trees and what kind of models they're going to focus on in that standard. And we're very much trying to encourage them to go down the route of providing models for that will deliver biodiversity and crop pollination services, and not just be about planting trees to lock up carbon. There does need to be an element of that, but there needs to be a balance of that as well. So we definitely would want the scheme to reflect that. And the other thing we're not so sure about is in terms of how the sort of nesting and the floral resource aspects that I've talked about more in general, how those are going to work, because in the pilots, they had a arable land standard and improved grass land standard, and those had some ideas for how, well, some specifications that you need to take out allocate a certain percentage of land for flowering, for sort of floral resource, a certain percentage for nesting resource. And those look great. Those are exactly what our recommendations were sort of leaning towards. Unfortunately, those standards seem to have disappeared from the from what's going to go into the first round of the actual launch, and we're not quite sure yet what the farmland biodiversity standard is going to come out. So hopefully that will have a balance of nesting and floral resource requirements in it. Otherwise, we'll end up with a situation we have now where we're putting a lot of floral resource options in, but we're not doing enough for nesting.
Fingers crossed. Great. We've run out of time. Thanks, Mike. That was a really interesting presentation, discussion. Just a couple of messages for everyone before we sign off. This has been recorded, so hopefully we'll be able to publish it on our YouTube page in due course. I just wanted to flag some upcoming events. So just about this branch in particular, we had our annual seminar last year on property flood resilience, which is really well received. We ran a sort of follow-on Q&A session recently and trying to answer some of the questions we didn't have time to cover during that session. That's on the YouTube page currently. The branch is currently planning a series of talks and events for the remainder of the year. There's one in September coming up soon on energy recovery, which we'll advertise pretty quickly, so keep an eye out for that. And an early flag that our annual seminar this year in October will be on water, land and air quality. We still need to finalise the content, but I think that'll be an interesting topic. So again, look out for details. More broadly, CIWEM as a whole, just want to flag a few things coming up soon. In August, there's a Wilder Carbon Project webinar free to attend, which maybe have some links to the topic of discussion on this session now. Also want to flag some training and mentoring services and information that CIWEM provides. There's collaborative leadership training, which is available through the website, which covers sort of mentoring as a profession and providing guidance on how to provide good mentoring leadership services. That links to a mentoring platform that CIWEM maintains. I think Barbara will probably put the link in the chat, but that's something people might want to look at. And then later in August, CIWEM has one of its fast track to membership sessions, which I can see Barbara's just posted. Okay, that's all. Just want to say thanks again to Mike for a really interesting session. Hopefully see you at another one in future soon. Thanks, everyone.